Welcome to Sherlock Holmes and the Secret of the Whispering Snow, a chilling mystery where a man is found frozen beneath untouched snow and a whisper haunts the night. Was it madness or murder? Stay close, dear listener, and tell us where you're listening from tonight. It was on one of those raw December mornings when London lay muffled beneath a slow, whispering fall of snow that I found Sherlock Holmes in a singular state of absorption. The fire in our sitting room at Baker Street burned low, and the grey light filtering through the curtains gave an almost spectral hue to the scene. Holmes sat at his usual place before the fire, his long, lean figure bent over a scrap of crumpled paper which he examined with his magnifying lens, his keen profile thrown into relief by the flicker of the flames. "You observe, Watson," he said without lifting his gaze. "That winter has finally decided to make itself known. The snow will bring silence to the city, and silence, my dear fellow, has a peculiar way of revealing the secrets people wish most to conceal." Before I could inquire what secrets he referred to, Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram on a tray. Holmes seized it eagerly, his eyes glinting with that unmistakable mixture of curiosity and triumph, which I had come to recognize as the herald of a new case. He unfolded the paper, scanned its contents, and let out a low whistle. "Ah, Scotland Yard seeks enlightenment once again. A curious business indeed. Listen to this, Watson." He read aloud. "Urgent matter at Northumberland Heath. Stop. Gentleman found frozen to death under inexplicable circumstances. Stop. No marks of violence, yet suspicion of foul play. Stop. Snow around body undisturbed. Stop. Lestrade requests your immediate presence. Stop." Holmes leapt to his feet, already reaching for his overcoat and muffler. "A man dead, Watson, in the snow. Without disturbance of any kind, and yet foul play suspected. The paradox is delicious." Within the hour, we were on our way through the muffled streets, the rhythmic crunch of horses' hooves softened by the heavy snowfall. London seemed strangely hushed, as if the entire city were holding its breath. Holmes sat opposite me in the cab, his fingers steepled and his expression alight with suppressed excitement. "A death by freezing," he mused aloud, "without footprints, without struggle, and with suspicion of murder. Lestrade must have some reason to suspect unnatural causes. What could it be? Perhaps the absence of logical explanation itself, always a strong indicator that logic lies hidden beneath the surface. We reached the small village of Northumberland Heath, just as the lamps were being lit. The snow lay deep upon the roofs, and the air hung heavy with that peculiar, metallic stillness which precedes a storm. Lestrade met us outside a modest country house that stood a little apart from the others, its gate half buried in drifts. "Glad you've come, Mr. Holmes," he said, stamping his boots. "It's the strangest thing I've seen in years. The man's name is Harold Merrow, wealthy enough, lived alone since his wife's death, found this morning by his housekeeper dead as stone in the front garden." "In the garden," Holmes repeated, his brows rising. "Aye, lying on the path, fully dressed, eyes wide open, but no sign of violence, no footprints leading to or from him. And, mind you, the snow was fresh last night. Untouched, it's as if he fell from the sky." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Lead the way." We followed Lestrade through the iron gate, the wind stinging our faces. The scene before us was as chilling as it was mystifying. A man of about 50 lay stretched upon the snow, his expression frozen in a look of terror so profound that it seemed to mock death itself. His grey hair was dusted with frost, and one gloved hand was raised as though to shield his face. Yet, as Lestrade had said, the snow around him was flawless, smooth, unbroken, untrampled. Holmes crouched beside the corpse and began his customary examination. He brushed a finger along the man's coat, sniffed lightly, and glanced at the nearby shrubs where delicate icicles clung to the branches. "No struggle," he murmured. "No signs of convulsion. Temperature of body, quite rigid. Death must have occurred between midnight and 3 this morning. He leaned closer, his magnifying glass catching a faint glimmer of reflected light. Curious, he muttered. Watson, observe the right ear. There's a faint bluish stain. Not frostbite, but something chemical. And the odor, yes, faint, but distinct ether. Lestrade frowned. Ether, you say? But how Holmes silenced him with a raised hand. Patience, my good Lestrade. Let us not speak of how until we know why. Tell me, was the house locked? From the inside, replied Lestrade. We had to force the door. Nothing's been disturbed within, except the study. His papers scattered, drawers open, but no sign of robbery, money and jewelry untouched. Ah, said Holmes softly, then the motive lies elsewhere. A secret, perhaps, rather than profit. He rose and surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping across the whitened expanse of the garden. Suddenly he stopped, pointing to a spot near the fence. Watson, your eyes, if you please. Do you see that faint irregularity in the snow? I peered closely. At first, I saw nothing unusual. But then I noticed a narrow line barely perceptible where the snow seemed slightly indented, as though something long and thin had been dragged across it. Excellent, said Holmes. A single trace amid a field of perfection. A rope, perhaps? Or a wire? He turned abruptly toward Lestrade. Has anyone examined the rooftop? The rooftop, Lestrade echoed, astonished. Holmes smiled faintly. When a man dies in a garden without footprints, my dear Lestrade, it is seldom the earth that conceals the truth but the air. As we stood there, the snow began to fall again, whispering softly over the scene, erasing even the faintest trace of what had been. And in that quiet moment, I saw the familiar spark of exhilaration in Holmes's eyes, the look that meant he had already glimpsed the outline of a mystery far deeper than any of us yet understood. Holmes remained crouched by the lifeless form for several minutes, his eyes moving from the still face to the immaculate snow that surrounded it. I could almost see his mind working, darting from one possibility to another, silently testing and discarding theories with that peculiar rapidity that so often left me breathless in admiration. He finally rose, brushing the snow from his knees, and cast a long glance at the sky. It is as I thought, he murmured. The snow conceals more than it reveals. We must go inside, Watson. There is something to be learned from the silence of the rooms where this man once lived. The interior of Harold Merrow's home had the unmistakable air of a life interrupted. The faint scent of tobacco and old books lingered in the hall. A single hat still hung on the stand, and a pair of walking boots, dusted with snow from days before, stood neatly by the door. Lestrade led us toward the study, his boots squeaking against the polished floorboards. Papers lay scattered across the carpet. A chair had been overturned, and on the writing desk lay a candle burned to its end beside a cracked glass of brandy. Holmes went directly to the hearth, where the last embers still glowed faintly. See here, Watson, he said, stooping to examine the ashes. The fire was stirred within the last 12 hours. And yet the air in this room is unnaturally cold. Do you feel it? Not merely the absence of warmth, but the presence of chill, deliberate, purposeful. He reached for the poker and stirred the ashes. Something metallic gleamed beneath the charred remains. With a small cry of satisfaction, he used his tweezers to extract a tiny cylinder no larger than my little finger. A hypodermic needle, he said softly. Unusual in a gentleman's study. Wouldn't you agree? Lestrade frowned. Could be the killer's, but there's no blood. No wound. Precisely, said Holmes, placing the needle carefully in his pocket. It may not have delivered blood but vapor. Ether, perhaps. The stain upon the ear we observed outside confirms that the victim inhaled it. But why in the open air? That, my dear Lestrade, is the riddle. He began to pace slowly about the room, his gaze flicking from one detail to another, the arrangement of books, the placement of the brandy glass, a small frame on the mantel. He stopped before it and lifted it carefully. Within was the photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a faint smile, her likeness fading slightly with time. "Mrs. Merrow, I presume," Holmes said. "Deceased, according to your report?" "2 years gone," Lestrade replied. "Fever. The servants say Mr. Merrow never recovered from it, rarely went out after that. Spent his time writing letters, though to whom no one knows. None ever posted." Holmes set the frame down gently. A man haunted by grief, living in solitude, writing letters he never sent. And then he dies in the snow, with fear etched upon his face. Curious. Grief alone does not summon terror. He approached the writing desk, lifting the top sheet from the scattered pile. The ink was fresh, and the writing trembled slightly, as though penned by a hand overcome by agitation. Holmes read silently for a moment, then turned to me with a grave expression. "Watson, listen to this. If the whisper comes again tonight, I shall go out to meet it. She calls from the snow. I must know if it is truly her voice." I felt a chill creep up my spine. Surely, Holmes, he was delusional. His wife's death must have. Holmes raised a hand. "Perhaps, or perhaps not. Men do not freeze to death chasing ghosts unless someone or something gives them reason to believe those ghosts speak." He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. "We shall learn more from the housekeeper." "Where is she?" "Lestrade. In the kitchen. Shaken. Poor soul." We found Mrs. Pratt, a thin, grey-haired woman, seated beside the range with trembling hands clasped about a teacup. Holmes questioned her gently. "You found the body?" "Yes, sir. Just after dawn. I saw the door open, and I thought perhaps he had gone for air. Then I saw him, lying there." Her voice quivered. He'd been so strange these last few nights. Said he heard her voice outside the window whispering his name like she used to before she passed. I told him it was only the wind, but he wouldn't listen. Last night I heard him speaking low, answering something I could not hear. Holmes's face remained unreadable. "And the windows? Were they secured?" "All locked, sir. Except the one in the study, it was open just a little. I thought the snow would blow in, so I meant to close it later." Holmes gave a faint smile, that dangerous glint appearing in his eyes again. "Quite so. Watson, note that the open window, the ether, and the whisper. We have the makings of a design, though its author remains unseen. Tell me, Mrs. Pratt, did your master have any visitors of late?" "Only one, sir," she said after a moment's thought. "A gentleman, foreign-looking, with pale eyes and a soft voice. Came 2 nights ago, just before the storm. Stayed for an hour. When he left, Mr. Merrow was pale as chalk." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Did this visitor give his name?" "No, sir. But I heard him say something strange as he went, 'You will hear her again when the snow falls.'" Holmes's expression hardened, and he turned toward the door. "Lestrade, have the roads watched. The whisper that called to Harold Merrow may have come not from heaven but from a man who knows precisely how to imitate the dead." Holmes stood for a long moment in the cold hallway after Mrs. Pratt's trembling words faded into silence. The ticking of a clock in the drawing-room seemed unnaturally loud. He moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and stared out at the falling snow as if listening for something. Then, quite suddenly, he turned on his heel and said briskly, "Watson, we return to Baker Street at once. There is more to this whisper than mere superstition, and I must consult certain chemical references that I keep under lock. Lestrade, remain here. Guard the house, and allow no one to disturb the study. By tomorrow morning, I believe we shall have something to discuss." We rode back through the snow in near silence. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly beneath the brim of his hat, and though the cab was freezing, he had thrown open the window to let the night air strike his face. "Do you not find it fascinating, Watson?" he said at last. "How men who boast of their reason and intellect are yet undone by a single whisper in the dark. There is something profoundly human in that, a weakness that certain minds are quick to exploit." "You believe, then, that this was no delusion of the senses?" I asked. "On the contrary," he replied, "I believe it was a delusion, one carefully designed and scientifically executed. The mention of ether is not accidental. When inhaled in small quantities, it can induce dizziness, confusion, and even auditory hallucinations. Our unknown visitor may have made use of that knowledge. But to what end? That, my dear Watson, is the question that keeps me awake." We reached Baker Street shortly before midnight. The familiar warmth of our sitting room greeted us, along with the crackle of the fire Mrs. Hudson had left burning. Holmes immediately cleared the table and began arranging glass vials, small filters, and a microscope with the methodical precision of a surgeon. From his pocket, he drew the tiny hypodermic cylinder and the folded letter taken from Merrow's desk. "The chemical residue upon this needle," he said, "will tell us much." He mixed several drops of a reagent with a faintly yellowish powder, producing a thin vapor that shimmered like frost. "As I thought," he said, peering into the light. "Not pure ether, something subtler. A compound mixture, likely diethyl ether combined with an aromatic sedative. It would produce calm in the body, but confusion in the mind, leaving the subject open to suggestion. A perfect instrument for manipulation." Holmes's hands moved quickly, his long fingers steady despite the late hour. "Now observe the ink upon this letter, Watson. You notice it fades slightly toward the lower edge of the page. That means it was written by candlelight, the flame flickering near exhaustion. The handwriting trembles more than that of an ordinary nervous man. It trembles as though the muscles themselves were weakening. Our victim was already under the influence of the vapor when he wrote this. The ether must have been released within the room, perhaps through that open window Mrs. Pratt mentioned. And if he believed he heard his wife's voice, then the suggestion must have been introduced at precisely that moment. I leaned closer. "You mean someone may have spoken to him while he was half insensible?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Or rather, someone made him believe he had been spoken to. Consider the conditions: darkness, grief, fatigue, and a narcotic haze. A whisper through the open window at such an hour could easily seem the voice of the departed. That is why the phrase, 'You will hear her again when the snow falls,' is so critical. It created the expectation. Once expectation takes hold, the mind completes the deception for you." He leaned back, lighting his pipe with a spark from the fire. "It is artistry of a rare kind, Watson. Psychological and chemical precision united for a single effect. But why frighten Merrow to death? Why not rob him, as a common villain would? Unless, of course, the goal was something less tangible than money." I watched him pace the floor, his shadow wavering across the wall. "Could this stranger have been someone connected to Mrs. Merrow?" I ventured. "A relative, perhaps, or an old admirer seeking revenge." Holmes stopped short. "An excellent hypothesis, my dear fellow. Grief makes the mind vulnerable, and those who know the shape of a man's sorrow can use it against him. Tomorrow, we shall learn what sort of woman Mrs. Merrow was and who might have benefited from her husband's madness or death." He sank into his armchair, eyes half closed, the smoke from his pipe curling lazily upward like a phantom thought taking shape. "The snow conceals footprints, but it also preserves the air," he murmured. "Somewhere in that quiet village, Watson, there is a man who knows how to turn silence into a weapon, and when the snow speaks again, I intend to listen." Outside, London lay still beneath its white shroud, and the faint chime of the midnight bell carried through the muffled streets. I could not help but feel that somewhere, in that lonely garden of Northumberland Heath, the whispering snow still guarded the secret of Harold Merrow's final terror, waiting for Holmes to uncover the voice that had called him to his death. The following morning dawned bleak and colourless, the kind of London morning when the air itself seemed to hang heavy with suspicion. Holmes had scarcely slept. I found him at the window with his violin under his chin, bowing a low, brooding tune that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. The fire had died. The remains of his midnight experiments lay scattered across the table, and a faint chemical odor still lingered in the air. When he finally set the violin aside, he said without turning, "Watson, we must return to Northumberland Heath. There is more buried in that house than snow upon its roof." By the time we arrived, Lestrade was pacing outside the gate, his collar turned up against the biting wind. "You were right, Mr. Holmes," he greeted us. "Someone's been tampering with the study. My men swear the place was secure last night, yet the desk has been opened again. Whoever it was knew exactly what to look for." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Ah, then our phantom has hands after all. Show me." Inside, the study was colder than ever. The fire had been extinguished completely, and a thin layer of frost had gathered on the window ledge. Holmes crouched immediately by the desk, noting the fresh marks upon the brass lock and the disturbed dust on the floor. "A fine file, half an inch wide, used no more than an hour ago," he muttered, "and footprints barely visible, but different from the constable's boots. Narrower, lighter, a man of refinement rather than labor." He rose abruptly and crossed to the window, running his fingers along the latch. "See here," Watson, moisture along the edge, still fresh. "The window was opened briefly after dawn. Our visitor must have entered here." Lestrade swore under his breath. "But how?" "The snow beneath is untouched." Holmes smiled faintly. "Because he did not descend to the ground. He used the roof. The marks we saw yesterday, that faint line in the snow, may have been made by a rope or cable connecting this window to the house opposite. A bold trick, but not an impossible one. Our man values silence and knows the value of a whisper in snow." He moved swiftly to the bookshelves, drawing his fingers across their spines until one volume caught his eye. It was a plain ledger bound in brown leather, its pages filled with rows of figures and names. Holmes turned a few pages, then tapped the corner with satisfaction. "Watson, observe the name R. Valdemar appears several times beside substantial sums. The handwriting differs from Merrow's. Someone was receiving money from him regularly until a month ago." He tore a strip of paper and marked the entry. "R. Valdemar, our foreign visitor. I should think. Lestrade. We shall require every record of that name you can find within 100 miles of London. Likely a false one, but false names leave real trails." As Lestrade hurried off to telegraph his office, Holmes leaned against the desk, his gaze lost in thought. "It fits too neatly, Watson. The man arrives days before the death, speaks of voices in the snow, and vanishes with the same silence. But it is not the killing that interests me, it is the artistry. To manipulate a man's senses so precisely, to time every detail so that fear itself becomes the weapon that requires knowledge of both science and psychology. We are not dealing with a common criminal. This is someone who studies the mind as a painter studies light." I shivered. "Then you believe Merrow's death was intentional, not accidental fright, but deliberate design?" "Without question," Holmes replied, "yet not murder in the ordinary sense. The hand that struck him down may never have touched him. No blade, no poison, only suggestion. That is what fascinates me. To kill by convincing a man that the dead speak, that is a crime committed upon the soul." At that moment, Lestrade returned breathless. "We've a lead. The name Valdemar appears in hotel records from Greenwich 2 nights ago, under a foreign registry. Description fits exactly what the housekeeper gave. He paid in cash and left before dawn." Holmes's eyes brightened with sudden intensity. "Excellent. Have a cab brought round immediately. Watson, bring your revolver. A man who toys with the human mind will not hesitate to silence those who seek his methods." We stepped back into the biting wind. I saw in Holmes the peculiar tension that always preceded his most dangerous pursuits, a quiet, electric certainty that the net was closing, though the quarry remained unseen. He turned once toward the whitening rooftops, his voice low but resolute. "The whispering snow. Watson, it spoke once to Harold Merrow. Before the day is out, I intend to make it speak again." The cab rattled through the narrow streets toward Greenwich, the air thick with sleet and the heavy promise of more snow. Holmes sat rigidly beside me, the collar of his coat drawn high and his eyes half closed, yet I could tell from the faint movement of his fingers against his knee that his mind was racing. Lestrade rode opposite us, fidgeting impatiently, eager for the physical chase that so often eluded him in Holmes's world of shadows and intellect. When at last the cab stopped before a small establishment called the King's Arms, Holmes stepped out first, his gaze sweeping over the inn's modest facade before he entered. The innkeeper, a portly man with ruddy cheeks, appeared at once behind the counter, rubbing his hands together. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Rooms are full, I'm afraid. We've had travelers stuck here since the storm began." "We are not seeking rooms," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "We are seeking a guest. Registered 2 nights ago under the name R. Valdemar. Paid in cash. Foreign accent. Pale eyes. Do you recall him?" The man's jovial expression dimmed into caution. I do. Strange sort, that one. Spoke little, but when he did, his voice gave me the chills. Said he was waiting on someone who never arrived. Left before dawn. Didn't even ask for his change." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "Did he leave anything behind? A note, a package, perhaps?" The innkeeper hesitated, then reached under the counter and produced a small brass token on a string. "Found this in his room after he'd gone. Didn't seem worth much, but it's odd, isn't it?" Holmes took it delicately. The token was circular, engraved with an unfamiliar sigil, 2 intertwined serpents forming a loop, their eyes tiny rubies. He held it to the light, studying it in silence before slipping it into his pocket. "You have rendered us a service, sir. One last question: did this man have visitors?" "Only one," said the innkeeper. "A woman. Came late, heavily veiled. Stayed less than 10 minutes. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Did you see her face?" "No, sir. But her voice, soft, foreign. Same as his, only gentler. She asked for him by name, then left in a carriage bound eastward." Holmes thanked the man, then motioned us outside. The wind cut across the street like a knife. "Watson," he said as we climbed back into the cab, "I have seen that symbol before. The double serpent. It is the mark of a certain occult society, once active in Prague and Vienna, known as Die Brüder der Stillstimme, the Brothers of the Silent Voice. Their experiments sought to induce auditory hallucinations through chemical influence and hypnosis. It was thought the sect dissolved years ago, but apparently at least one of its adherents still breathes." Lestrade looked incredulous. "You mean to tell me we're chasing some kind of foreign magician?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Magician, scientist, or charlatan, the distinction is small when the effect is real. Consider it. Lestrade. Ether. Vapor to numb the senses. Whispered suggestion through hidden means. And an isolated man driven to madness. It bears every hallmark of the silent voice." The cab lurched forward through the deepening snow. For several minutes, none of us spoke. Then Holmes rapped on the roof, ordering the driver to stop at a telegraph office. Inside, he scribbled a rapid message and handed it to the clerk. "To Mycroft Holmes, Pall Mall. Obtain record of foreign correspondence from Austria to 1 Harold, Merrow, Northumberland Heath. Keywords: Valdemar. Silent voice." He handed the note across with a coin. "Immediate transmission." When we emerged, the snow had thickened, dimming even the gaslights. Holmes's face was grave, almost contemplative. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are dealing with a man who kills without touching, a mind that understands the weaknesses of other minds as intimately as I understand tobacco ash. If my suspicion proves true, Merrow was not the first to hear a voice that was not there, and he will not be the last unless we silence it at its source." We reached Baker Street just as darkness fell. Holmes moved directly to the mantel, lighting the fire with quick, decisive strokes. "Tomorrow, we return to Northumberland Heath. I intend to recreate the conditions of Merrow's final night, the same snow, the same open window. The same silence. If the whisper comes again, Watson, I shall be waiting to hear it not as a victim, but as a hunter. He paused, eyes fixed on the flames. The dead do not speak, Watson, but those who know how to mimic them may wield power greater than death itself. And tonight, somewhere in London, that voice is listening. The following evening was one of those ghostly London nights when the snow fell so silently that even the sound of passing cabs seemed muffled, as though the city itself were holding its breath. I found Holmes already dressed for departure, his lantern in hand, and that unmistakable gleam of anticipation in his eyes. The plan he had hinted at earlier was now fully formed. "Tonight, Watson," he said as we stepped into the swirling flakes, "we shall stand in the same place where Harold Merrow met his end, and see whether reason can unmask what fear has hidden. If my calculations are correct, the whisper will return, and I intend to trace its source before it vanishes into the night." Lestrade met us at the gate of Merrow's house, his breath visible in the freezing air. "We've cleared the garden, sir," he said, stamping his boots. "No footprints since yesterday, just as you ordered. And the servants are gone to the inn, save for Mrs. Pratt, who's refused to leave her kitchen." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Excellent. A controlled environment. That is precisely what we require. Watson, keep your revolver close, but do not draw it unless I say so. The danger tonight will come not from brute force, but from deception." Inside, the house was utterly still. The study had been prepared as Holmes directed. Curtains drawn, the fire unlit, the window left slightly open. The faint draught carried a scent of snow and something else cold. Metal, sharp and chemical. Holmes set the lantern upon the desk and adjusted its wick to a dim glow. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Even the air feels wrong thinner, as if something unseen lingers within it." He produced the brass token from his pocket and placed it on the desk, directly beside the hypodermic cylinder. "This," he said, "is our lure. The man who came here before was meticulous. He will not risk another intrusion without purpose, but he will not be able to resist verifying whether his little masterpiece continues to function. The human mind, Watson, even a criminal one, is ever drawn back to the scene of its triumph." We waited in silence. Minutes passed, the only sound the slow ticking of the clock. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something, a murmur, so soft it might have been the wind moving through the trees. Holmes raised a hand, signaling me to remain still. The whisper grew clearer, though still distant, almost intimate in tone. It was a woman's voice. "Harold! Harold! Come to me!" My blood ran cold. The voice was low and tender, with that strange ethereal quality that seems to bypass reason entirely. For a moment, even I felt its pull, and I understood how a lonely man, steeped in grief, might have believed it. Holmes's expression, however, did not waver. His gaze darted toward the open window. He moved silently across the room, gesturing for me to follow. The whisper came again, this time closer, almost inside the room. Holmes snatched the lantern and flung it toward the window, flooding the garden below with light. "There!" he shouted. For an instant I saw movement, a shadow shifting along the upper edge of the wall, the glint of something metallic. Then came a sharp hiss and the faintest scent of ether. Holmes leapt forward, slamming the window shut, just as a thin glass vial shattered against the pane. The vapor hung outside like a pale mist before dissolving into the night. "Quickly, Watson!" he cried. "Downstairs and out, he's on the roof." We burst into the snow-covered garden. The lantern light danced wildly over the drifts. A dark figure darted along the adjoining rooftop, cloak streaming behind him. Holmes pursued with astonishing speed, clambering up the trellis and vanishing over the gutter with an agility I would never have believed possible. I followed more slowly, my heart pounding, until I reached the top and saw the two men silhouetted against the dim glow of the sky. Holmes had cornered him by the chimney. "End of the line, Valdemar," he said coolly. "Your whispers have spoken for the last time." The man turned, and for the first time I saw his face pale, sharp, with eyes like frozen steel. "You understand nothing, Mr. Holmes," he said softly, his accent thick and foreign. "You call it crime, I call it art. Fear is the truest language of the human soul." Holmes took a step forward, but before he could act, Valdemar flung something small and gleaming into the air. There was a flash, a burst of smoke, and when it cleared, he was gone, vanished into the snow and shadows below. Holmes leaned over the edge, scanning the ground, but there was no trace, only the whispering wind and the faint echo of that voice fading into the storm. He turned to me, eyes blazing. "He is clever, Watson, too clever to vanish without a trace. But he has made one mistake. He believes he understands fear. Tomorrow, we shall teach him what true terror feels like when reason itself hunts him." The snow had ceased by dawn, leaving the rooftops silvered under a pale, indifferent sky. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in grim silence, both chilled to the bone, yet too restless to sleep. The fire burned brightly, but even its warmth could not dispel the strange unease that clung to us like a shadow. Holmes threw off his coat, sat down before the hearth, and lit his pipe with a sharp flick of the match. "We came closer tonight than he expected, Watson," he said finally, his voice low but charged with purpose. "And though Valdemar slipped through our fingers, he has revealed more than he intended." I sank into the chair opposite him, still feeling the sting of the cold on my hands. "Then you have discovered something, some clue we missed in that chaos?" Holmes's eyes glittered through the rising smoke. "Clue? No. Confirmation? Yes. You observed his little contrivance, the vial of ether hurled against the window. It was not an act of desperation, but of routine. He came to test his apparatus, to see if the whisper carried properly. The ether, you see, served as both medium and weapon. Mixed with the proper chemical base, it could create auditory illusions when inhaled or absorbed through the skin. That, coupled with the resonance of sound through hidden tubes, is what produced the illusion of a voice in the air. Ingenious. Watson, diabolically so." I leaned forward, incredulous. "Hidden tubes? You believe the voice was transmitted mechanically?" "Precisely. The window was the entry point for both vapor and sound. Remember the faint line we found in the snow on the first night? It was not a rope for climbing, but a conduit, a narrow wire through which sound could travel from an adjacent point. Valdemar, or an accomplice, would speak softly into a device connected to the wire, and the sound would emerge within the garden as a whisper, carried upon the drifting vapor. To a man half delirious with chemical fumes and grief, the illusion would be irresistible." He rose suddenly, pacing before the fire. "But there is more. That brass token, the twin serpents, was not merely a symbol of his order, but a signature, left deliberately to instill fear. The brothers of the silent voice were not content with secrecy. They gloried in being half-believed. Each victim became a messenger of their legend. Lestrade arrived soon after, weary but eager, shaking the snow from his hat. "We've scoured the area, Mr. Holmes. No trace of your Valdemar. But we did find something curious near the railway embankment, a small shed with chemical bottles and a portable phonograph. Looks foreign-made." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Excellent, Lestrade. Then he has not yet fled the country. He will not abandon his instrument so near completion." He snatched his coat once more. "Come, Watson. There is only one man in London who can tell us what mixture of ether and sound could achieve such an effect. Professor Wilhelm Strauss, late of Vienna, now residing in Bloomsbury. If my theory is sound, Strauss's research was the seed from which Valdemar's poison grew." The morning traffic had begun to stir when we reached the narrow Bloomsbury Street. Holmes led the way up the steps of a shabby lodging-house and knocked briskly. A thin man with spectacles opened the door, his expression cautious until he recognized Holmes. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, I had heard rumors of your interest in acoustics." Holmes inclined his head. "Rumors travel quickly, Professor. I come concerning one of your former associates, an Valdemar. The professor's face paled slightly. Valdemar? My God, I thought him dead. He was expelled from the university for experiments that crossed every moral line. He believed that sound, pure vibration could reach into the subconscious, alter perception, even induce hallucination when combined with vapor stimuli. I destroyed my notes after his last attempt nearly killed a subject. Holmes exchanged a grim glance with me. Then he has perfected your unfinished work. Tell me, Professor, could his device project sound at a distance through wire or tube without distortion? Strauss hesitated, then nodded slowly. It is possible. He once spoke of building a portable resonator, tuned to human frequencies. If he has achieved it, the effect would be supernatural to the listener. Holmes thanked the man curtly and turned toward the door. Then it is as I feared. He has transformed science into superstition. Outside, the wind had grown sharp again. Holmes tightened his scarf, his tone cold and decisive. We are closing in, Watson. Tonight, Valdemar will attempt his masterpiece. Perhaps upon another victim, or perhaps upon us. But I intend to make him believe that the whisper has turned against him. For the first time, the hunter will hear his own voice in the dark. The remainder of that day passed in restless preparation. Holmes's plan, as he unfolded it to me, was simple in outline but perilous in execution. He intended to draw Valdemar into the open by convincing him that his own devices had turned against him. A man such as Valdemar, Holmes said, possesses one blind spot, the arrogance of mastery. He believes he alone can command illusion. To make him fear his own creation will strike at the very root of his control. He spent the afternoon modifying a small phonographic mechanism, adjusting the cylinders and inserting a narrow reed-like tube that trailed into a coil of wire. I recognized in the design a mirror of the contrivance Valdemar had used, but Holmes had added one crucial difference. The device could reverse the direction of sound, projecting it back along its conduit. We shall make the snow whisper to him, Holmes murmured. Only this time, the voice he hears will not comfort him. As night drew in, we took a hansom to Northumberland Heath once again. The storm had returned, thick flakes swirling through the gaslight in a hypnotic dance. Lestrade's men had kept watch discreetly through the day, but there had been no sign of Valdemar. The moment we stepped inside Merrow's house, Holmes motioned for silence and began setting up the modified device near the study window. He fed the wire through the same narrow opening Valdemar had once used and anchored it to the frame with delicate precision. Then, in a voice low and deliberate, he said, "Watson, fetch me the paper from the desk, the one containing Merrow's final words. Our phantom will recognize them, and when he does, he will show his hand." I found the note and handed it to him. Holmes read aloud, his tone eerily calm. "If the whisper comes again tonight, I shall go out to meet it." He paused and turned a switch. The words, faintly distorted, echoed through the wire and out into the cold beyond the glass. A moment later, the echo returned soft at first, like breath against the pane, then clearer, stronger. "Holmes," I whispered, gripping his arm. "That voice, it isn't yours." "Steady, Watson," he murmured. "He has taken the bait." From somewhere beyond the garden, a figure moved dimly visible through the falling snow. The voice came again, mocking now, each syllable deliberate. "You meddle with what you do not understand, Mr. Holmes." Holmes adjusted the lantern toward the window. "On the contrary, Mr. Valdemar, I understand it perfectly. You used the sorrow of a grieving man as your laboratory. You wrapped cruelty in the veil of science. Tell me, how does it feel to hear your own invention speak without your command?" The shadow paused. And for a heartbeat, there was only the wind. Then the voice answered, strained, almost trembling. "It cannot be you have reversed the current." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Indeed, the whisper obeys its master no longer." He flicked another switch, and from the garden came a low hum. building slowly to a pitch that made the glass vibrate. Valdemar staggered into view, clutching his head, his features twisted with fury and disbelief. "You would use my art against me," he shouted. "Then you shall share in its curse." He flung another vial toward the house. But this time, Holmes was ready. With one swift motion, he slammed the shutters closed. The vial struck the wood and burst harmlessly against it, releasing only a faint hiss. Holmes sprang to his feet. "Now, Watson! Lestrade!" We rushed into the storm, lanterns cutting through the dark. Valdemar stumbled across the drifts toward the iron fence, the wire still trailing from his hand. Holmes caught him by the collar just as he tried to leap the gate. The man struggled fiercely, but the fight drained out of him almost at once. The cold had already begun its work. Holmes turned him over and looked into his pale, furious eyes. "The whisper is silent now," he said quietly. "It dies with the deceit that birthed it." Valdemar managed a faint, bitter smile. "You cannot stop the silent voice. Others will continue what I began." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, his tone as sharp as the wind. "But they will do so, knowing that even silence can betray them." By the time Lestrade's men reached us, Valdemar was unconscious, his pulse weak but steady. He was carried away to the yard, while Holmes stood motionless by the gate, the snow whitening his coat and hat. For a long while, neither of us spoke. At last, he said softly, "He played upon fear, Watson, because it is the only emotion that obeys both science and superstition. Yet in the end, he fell victim to the same illusion. He created the belief that control over fear makes one immune to it." When we finally turned back toward the house, dawn was beginning to pale the horizon. The garden, swept clean by the wind, bore no trace of the night's struggle. Only the broken wire hanging from the window remained, swaying gently in the quiet air, a faint reminder of the voice that had once haunted the snow and of the man who had tried to make silence speak. It was nearly midday when we returned to Baker Street, exhausted but unable to rest. The events of the night had left me unsettled, the haunting voice, the flash of Valdemar's fury, and the eerie quiet that followed his capture played over in my mind like a recurring nightmare. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the chase. He moved briskly around the sitting room, lighting the fire, setting his instruments in order, and spreading upon the table a fresh sheaf of papers Lestrade had delivered that morning. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "I have seldom encountered a case where intellect and cruelty met so elegantly." Valdemar's methods were not born of madness, but of obsession. He saw human fear as a mechanism, something that could be triggered like a lever or a switch. He placed a document before me. It was a letter written in a firm, slanted hand and stamped with the seal of the Metropolitan Police. "Lestrade informs me that Valdemar has spoken, though not freely. He admits to being part of the Brotherhood of the Silent Voice, but he claims to have acted under orders. There is, it appears, a hierarchy to their craft." I leaned closer, reading the summary Lestrade had sent. According to Valdemar's own statement, the Brotherhood's purpose was not merely scientific, it was philosophical. They believed the mind could be liberated through controlled terror, that the boundary between reason and hallucination could be crossed safely if one understood the precise balance of stimulus and sound. "It's a perversion of science," muttered. "They toy with sanity as though it were an experiment." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. And that is why it fascinates me. Fear, when applied with precision, becomes an art form to men of that persuasion. But their arrogance blinds them. They forget that terror, once released, rarely obeys its master." He turned to another sheet, Mycroft's reply from the Foreign Office. "Mycroft has been most efficient. It seems our friend Valdemar was not the first of his kind to arrive in England. There was another professor, Heinrich Stahl, a former physiologist from Vienna, known to have lectured on the psychology of perception. He disappeared 2 years ago after a series of patients under his care suffered nervous collapse. The Brotherhood's trail runs through him." Holmes tapped the paper, Stahl was seen recently in the company of a certain financier, Lord Chetwynd, whose estate lies only 20 miles from London. Chetwynd has been pouring money into experimental research for months. If my deduction holds, Valdemar was working under Stahl's instruction, and the Brotherhood's true center lies not abroad, but here, under English snow. I watched him pace, his excitement growing. "Then you mean to visit this Lord Chetwynd?" "This very evening," Holmes replied. "Lestrade will have Valdemar under guard, and I have sent word that his capture may draw out the rest. Chetwynd, I believe, fancies himself a patron of intellects, a collector of minds as others collect art. He will not resist the temptation to gloat before one he believes incapable of understanding his vision." The hours crawled by. By twilight, a thick mist had rolled over the Thames, swallowing the city in a damp, eerie glow. We left by cab, the rhythmic clatter of the horse echoing faintly against the invisible walls of fog. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, his face composed, but his eyes burning with the quiet certainty of a man nearing the heart of a puzzle. When we reached Chetwynd Manor, the great house loomed like a silhouette cut from shadow. The servant who admitted us was pale and nervous, leading us down a long corridor lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow our every step. Lord Chetwynd awaited us in a high-ceilinged drawing room, his figure tall, his expression refined but strangely cold. "My dear Mr. Holmes," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "your reputation precedes you. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Holmes inclined his head. "To an unfortunate matter involving one of your acquaintances, our Valdemar." Chetwynd's smile faltered, just perceptibly. "Ah, brilliant man, though somewhat extreme in his beliefs. I sponsored his work for a time. I fear he lacked the temperament for subtlety." "Subtlety," Holmes repeated softly. "You mean the art of killing without a weapon, of reducing a man to madness through sound and suggestion. Forgive me, my lord, but I had not thought cruelty could be so tastefully phrased." Chetwynd's expression darkened, though his tone remained measured. "You mistake me, sir. We sought enlightenment, not murder. To touch the human spirit where reason cannot go, that was Valdemar's aim, and mine." "Then Harold Merrow's death was merely an accident of philosophy?" Holmes asked. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Chetwynd's hand twitched slightly at his side, and in that instant, Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You need not answer," he said. "Your reaction suffices. The Brotherhood may claim to chase truth, but your truth is written in ether and blood." At that, Chetwynd laughed softly, bitterly. "You think you've unmasked me, Mr. Holmes, but you have merely seen one corner of the design. The silent voice will not die with Valdemar, nor with me. It is already spreading through laboratories, through hospitals, through every mind that seeks knowledge without fear." Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the misted air. "Then it ends tonight. You've mistaken silence for power. It is not the whisper that rules men. Chetwynd, it is conscience." The words hung there as Lestrade entered with 2 constables. Chetwynd's calm collapsed. He turned toward the desk, reaching for something gleaming among the papers, a small cylinder connected to wires. Holmes was faster. With a swift motion, he snatched it away and crushed the fragile device beneath his heel. A hiss of vapor escaped, rising briefly like smoke from a dying flame. Chetwynd sagged into his chair, his face ashen. "You cannot stop it," he murmured. "You've silenced one whisper, but others will come." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Perhaps, but they will not find the world as willing to listen." We left the manor just as the snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. Holmes drew his coat close, his voice quiet as he gazed into the white distance. "You see, Watson, men like Valdemar and Chetwynd never understand the true secret of silence. It is not a weapon, it is the soul's mirror. Those who stare into it too long only hear their own madness echo back." And as we rode away, The faint flakes swirled through the gaslight like whispers fading into peace, the last trace of a darkness that had finally lost its voice. The following morning broke dim and reluctant, the winter sun struggling to push through a pall of London fog. I awoke to find Holmes already at the table, deep in contemplation, a half-finished cup of coffee beside him and several sheets of foolscap covered in his neat, slanting hand. His violin lay across the back of the chair as though he had risen mid-note. The fire crackled quietly, fighting the chill that crept through the room. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then, without looking up, he said in that tone of detached calm that always heralded the close of a case, "It is done, Watson, yet not ended." I sat opposite him, blinking away the remnants of sleep. "You mean Chetwynd and Valdemar? Lestrade has them both in custody. Surely that ends the affair." Holmes glanced toward the window where the fog pressed against the glass. "Ends it for Scotland Yard, perhaps, but not for me. There is one question that remains unanswered, a question more dangerous than any criminal's confession." He looked up at last, his grey eyes alive with that peculiar fire of restless intellect. Why did Chetwynd fund such a monstrous pursuit in the first place? No man risks his fortune and his reputation for the sake of curiosity alone. I watched him as he rose and paced the hearthrug, his hands clasped behind his back. "You suspect some deeper motive. I am certain of it. Men like Chetwynd seldom act without the promise of influence. And Valdemar was merely a craftsman, a man who understood instruments but not consequence. The guiding hand was elsewhere. I would wager that among Chetwynd's correspondence lies a thread that leads beyond this brotherhood, a mind yet greater, subtler, and more dangerous than any we have seen." Before I could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, looking slightly alarmed. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent. Wouldn't give his name, but he speaks with a foreign accent." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Show him in." The visitor was a tall, gaunt man, with a long overcoat dusted in snow. His face was pale, his hair neatly combed, and his gloved hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. There was a quiet refinement about him that contrasted oddly with his nervous manner. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "my name is Dr. Emil Hartmann. I come at great risk. I was once associated with Heinrich Stahl." At that name, Holmes's eyes flickered. "Indeed. Pray sit, Dr. Hartmann. You have chosen your moment wisely. We were just discussing your colleague." Hartmann sat, his gaze darting toward me before settling back on Holmes. "I heard of Valdemar's arrest. It was only a matter of time. But you must understand, Valdemar was not the leader. Professor Stahl, was the true architect. He used us all. The Brotherhood of the Silent Voice was never meant to pursue knowledge. It was an instrument, a weapon disguised as philosophy." Holmes leaned forward. "A weapon? For whom?" "For those who could afford it," Hartmann said bitterly. "Chetwynd was only one of many patrons. There are men across Europe who would pay dearly for the ability to bend a mind without force. Stahl promised them that power. He believed fear was the purest form of control, make a man believe his own senses betray him, and he becomes utterly pliant." I felt a cold unease settle over me. "You mean they intended to use this method for political ends?" "Exactly," Hartmann replied. "The Brotherhood's research was funded not by mystics, but by statesmen. Experiments were conducted in Prague, Vienna, and Paris. When Stahl fled the continent, I thought his work destroyed. But when I heard whispers of deaths here in England, voices in the snow, I knew he had continued." Holmes's gaze grew distant, his mind already racing ahead. "Then Stahl still lives?" Hartmann nodded. "Yes, he will know of Valdemar's capture by now, and if I know him, he will not flee. He will come for what remains of his design. He cannot abide loose ends." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then we shall leave him one." By afternoon we were on the road again, bound for a small village outside, reading where Hartmann believed Stahl had taken refuge. The snow thickened as we went, and by the time we arrived, dusk had settled a pale, ghostly light that blurred the edges of every shape. The cottage Hartman directed us to was solitary, crouched against a line of trees. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney. Holmes dismounted quietly and motioned for silence. "Watson, stay close. Stahl is a man of intellect. Not impulse, but intellect can be deadly when cornered." We approached through the drifts, our breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. Holmes tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lamp. Papers lay strewn across a table, beside a mechanical contraption of brass and glass, similar to Valdemar's device, but far more intricate. A faint hum emanated from it, as though it were alive. At the far end of the room stood a man tall, stooped, with iron-grey hair and piercing eyes that glowed with fanatic intensity. He did not startle when we entered. Instead, he smiled faintly, as though he had expected us. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a voice smooth as silk. "At last." I had wondered when reason would come knocking at the door of imagination. Holmes inclined his head. "Professor Heinrich Stahl, I presume. You've caused more disturbance in London than 100 criminals, yet you stand there as calm as a lecturer before a class." Stahl spread his hands. "Because I am no criminal. I am a visionary. You see, Mr. Holmes, humanity fears the unknown. I sought to make that fear visible, to give it voice. What is madness but the mind turned inward upon itself? I merely held up the mirror. You held it to men who could not look away," Holmes said sharply. "Harold Merrow died believing his dead wife called to him. You used grief as your laboratory." Stahl's expression softened almost pityingly. "Ah, the sentimental English heart, always confusing morality with limitation. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, do you not manipulate perception yourself? You play upon deduction as I upon emotion. We are the same, only my medium is fear." Holmes stepped closer, his tone icily precise. "The difference, Professor, is that I bring men back from delusion, you bury them in it." For the first time, Stahl's composure wavered. "You think you've won? Even now, my work is beyond your reach. The apparatus on that table can reproduce the frequency of the human subconscious. A single tone, sustained at the right pitch, can drive the mind to believe anything." Holmes's eyes darted to the machine. "And yet," he said softly, "you cannot hear it." Stahl frowned. "What do you mean?" "Because it is already speaking to you." Holmes's hand shot out, twisting a small dial on the device. The hum deepened, filling the air with a strange, pulsing vibration. Stahl staggered, clutching his temples. "Stop it! You don't know what—" But Holmes did know. He had reversed the polarity, turning the signal inward. The tone grew higher, sharper, until the professor collapsed to his knees, gasping. I leapt forward to intervene, but Holmes caught my arm. "No, Watson. Listen." Through the rising pitch came faint words not from us, but from the machine itself, looping fragments of Stahl's own recorded voice. "Fear is truth. Truth is fear," the man cried out, his own creation tormenting him. With one swift motion, Holmes shut the device down. Stahl slumped forward, unconscious but alive. "Self-defeat," Holmes said quietly. "The inevitable end of all who mistake power for enlightenment." We carried him outside, where Lestrade, whom Holmes had summoned by telegram earlier, arrived with 2 constables. As they led Stahl away, the snow began to fall again, steady and soft, erasing our footprints as though London itself wished to forget. Later, back at Baker Street, I watched Holmes in silence. He stood by the window, pipe in hand, gazing at the falling snow. "So it ends," I said. "The Brotherhood dismantled, its leaders imprisoned. You should be satisfied." Holmes did not turn. "Satisfied?" "No, Watson. Intrigued, perhaps. Men like Stahl do not invent terror, they merely uncover it. Every man has within him a silent voice, waiting to be awakened. The true danger lies not in those who build the machines, but in those willing to listen. He drew the curtain shut, extinguishing the view. Remember this case, my dear fellow, when you next write your chronicles. It will remind you that reason, for all its light, must always tread close to shadow. The clock struck midnight. Outside, the whispering snow fell endlessly over the city, covering every sound, every sin, every secret. And though the case was closed, I could not help but feel, as I watched the embers die in the hearth, that somewhere in that white silence the faintest echo of a voice still lingered, soft, persistent, and terribly human.